My son-in-law left his phone behind at my place, and it just kept buzzing with my daughter's name lighting up the screen. But here's the thing, she was sitting right beside me at that very moment. When I picked it up and heard that low, silky voice purring, "Hey handsome, I've been counting down the hours until tonight," I knew my carefully ordered little world was about to come apart at the seams. That voice belonged to Jessica Parker, the real estate agent who'd guided us through buying this home 5 years earlier. Let me bring you back to how this particular disaster began to unravel. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October, one of those brilliantly crisp days in suburban Minneapolis where the maple trees seemed to be competing for attention, and regular families were supposed to be having regular conversations about regular things. Instead, I was about to discover that my daughter's husband had been living a double life. David had left his cell phone to Sarah and watched David's throat work as he swallowed. Her fingers swept across the screen with growing urgency. Her expression moved from hopeful to confused to utterly shattered in under 30 seconds. 15 calls. She whispered, 15 calls between you and Jessica Parker this week. Text messages. Her voice faltered as she read on. Then she looked up at David, eyes glistening. She texted you at 11 last night. Thanks for a perfect evening. Already thinking about Tuesday. David, what happens on Tuesday? I quietly filed that away. David's shoulders caved in like something had punctured him. Sarah, I can explain. Can you explain this one too? She pressed, her tone growing sharper. 3 days ago. The lingerie you love is on sale at Victoria's Secret. Should I grab something new for Thursday? My accountant's mind was automatically cataloging the evidence, a pattern of communication, intimate messages, references to shared evenings, a web of deception unspooling over weeks, possibly months. But my mother's heart was breaking as I watched Sarah's world disintegrate in front of me. How long? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked physically ill. Sarah, it's complicated. How long? Silence, then barely audible. 6 months. The words landed like a blow in the middle of that kitchen. 6 months. Half a year of Sunday brunches where David had looked me directly in the eyes and asked about my week while carrying on with the woman who'd sold us this house. Half a year of watching Sarah make plans for their future together while he made plans for Tuesday and Thursday evenings with someone else. Sarah set the phone on the counter with such deliberate gentleness it might have been made of glass. Then she walked to the kitchen island and locked both hands on the edge until her knuckles bleached white. I need you to leave, she said, still not looking at him. Sarah, please just let me explain. Leave now. Go to Jessica's. Go to a hotel. Go straight to hell for all I care. But get out of my mother's house. And don't you dare try to follow me when I go. David glanced at me as though I might step in on his behalf. I raised one eyebrow in a way that clearly communicated, not a chance in this lifetime. After he slunk out like the coward he'd revealed himself to be, Sarah and I settled in my living room with fresh cups of coffee and the wreckage of her marriage laid out between us like a crime scene. I should have seen it coming, she said, staring into her mug. All those late nights, all those work dinners, all those moments when he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I wanted to comfort her, to remind her that cheaters are masters of deception, that none of this reflected on her. But I also wanted to understand the full depth of the betrayal. Sweetheart, I said gently, what else might he be hiding? Sarah looked up at me with red, rimmed eyes in which something sharp and dangerous was beginning to kindle. You know what, Mom? I think it's time we found out. Monday morning found Sarah and me seated in my home office like two generals mapping a campaign. Sarah had called in sick to work, understandably, given that she looked like she'd been swiped by an emotional freight train. But beneath the devastation, something else was surfacing, a focused, cold fury. And there is nothing more formidable than a furious woman whose mother has spent 30 years in forensic accounting. I've been going over this all night, Sarah said, spreading documents across my desk. If David lied about Jessica, what else has he been lying about? Smart girl. I raised her right. We started with their joint checking account. David worked as a project manager for a construction firm, bringing in a decent but not spectacular income. The expenses appeared ordinary at first glance: mortgage, utilities, groceries, the standard suburban necessities. But I'd spent 3 decades reading financial statements, the way a detective reads a crime scene. Look at these cash withdrawals, I said, pointing to the screen. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 6 months, $200 each time. Sarah leaned in closer. That's $1,600 a month in cash. What's he spending it on? Hotels, most likely. You can't charge a hotel room to a joint credit card when you're cheating on your wife. We kept digging. Sarah's pain was transmuting before my eyes into investigative determination, and I felt a surge of pride watching her work. She had inherited my methodical nature, along with my absolute intolerance for financial dishonesty. "Mom, look at this," she said, pulling up their credit card statements. "Jessica Parker Real Estate. He's been paying her something labeled consultation fees every month." Consultation fees. I said dryly, "Unless she's consulting on bedroom decor, I'd call that creative invoicing. $600 a month," Sarah muttered. "For what? We bought this house 3 years ago." As we peeled back more layers, the situation grew uglier by the minute. David had taken a second mortgage against their house without notifying Sarah, entirely unlawful since both their names appeared on the deed. He'd opened a credit card in his name alone and racked up $15,000 in debt. He'd even cashed out his $401k early and absorbed the penalties. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I have to talk. I know you're furious." Furious? Sarah's voice could have frozen running water. "David, furious is what I am when you leave the toilet seat up. What I am right now is beyond furious. I'm discovering that my husband is a lying, cheating financial criminal. What are you talking about?" "I never, David. I am staring at bank statements showing you've drained our financial security to bankroll your affair. I'm looking at credit card bills for hotel rooms and jewelry I've never laid eyes on. I'm looking at a second mortgage you took out on our home without my knowledge or consent. Tell me, which part of that should I be calm about?" The silence from David's end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd disconnected. "How did you?" he started, then caught himself. "How did I find out?" "Really, David, you might want to reconsider who you married. I'm an accountant's daughter. Following a money trail is practically in my blood. Sarah, please just let me explain." "It isn't what it looks like." "Then explain what DB Enterprises is and how you managed to purchase a property with Jessica Parker when you've maxed out our joint credit cards." Another long silence. Then David's voice returned smaller, more defeated than I'd ever heard it. "How much do you know?" Sarah looked at me and smiled for the first time since Sunday. It wasn't a kind smile. "Why don't you come by Mom's tonight around 7 and we'll compare notes," she said. "Bring Jessica." I think it's high time we all had a genuine conversation. She hung up before he could answer. "Sarah," I said, genuinely admiring her. "That was masterful." "I had a good teacher," she replied. "Now, what are the odds David and Jessica actually show up tonight?" I thought it over while printing copies of all the financial evidence we'd compiled. "They'll show up," I said with confidence. "David's too rattled to think clearly, and Jessica is too invested in whatever scheme they're running together to let him handle this solo." "Good," Sarah said, squaring the papers into neat stacks, "because I have a few questions that need answering." Watching my daughter transform in real time from a heartbroken wife into a calculating investigator reminded me exactly why I'd worked so hard to make sure she grew up strong and self-sufficient. Some skills you hope your children will never have occasion to use, but when the moment comes, you want to be certain they're equipped for battle. At precisely 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I'll say this for cheating scoundrels, they have good punctuality. David stood on my front porch looking like he hadn't slept, with Jessica Parker at his side wearing the kind of ensemble that announced, "I dress for male attention." She was younger than I remembered, early 30s, maybe with the sort of polished attractiveness that comes from personal trainers and high-end salons. "Margaret," David said awkwardly, "thank you for having us. I didn't invite anyone." I replied pleasantly, "Sarah summoned you. I'm merely providing the location." "Come in." Sarah was waiting in my living room, seated in my late husband's leather armchair as though holding court. She had changed into her sharpest professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that made her look every inch the accomplished businesswoman she was. "Smart move. Never let them see the wound, Jessica," Sarah said with glacial courtesy as they settled in. "How wonderful to see you again. I don't believe we've spoken since you helped us buy our home 3 years ago." Jessica had enough self-awareness to look uncomfortable. David just looked cornered. "Sarah," Jessica began, "I want you to understand that neither David nor I planned for any of this to happen." "Oh, please," I interrupted, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of coffee. "Spare us," though we fell helplessly in love routine. Grown adults make choices. Own yours. Sarah opened a thick folder of printouts. "Let's skip past the romantic subplot and focus on the financial fraud." David's face drained of color. "The what?" "The second mortgage you took out on our home without my knowledge or authorization. The $15,000 in hidden credit card debt. The cash withdrawals that happen to align perfectly with your hotel charges. And then there's DB Enterprises," Sarah continued, spreading out property records. "The company that purchased 123 Elm Street from Jessica's agency, significantly below market value. Cash transaction, no inspection, expedited closing." Both David and Jessica looked ill. "Here's my theory," Sarah said, her voice gaining momentum. "Jessica identified undervalued properties through her industry contacts. David used our home equity and his retirement savings to fund cash purchases through his shell company. They buy low. Jessica relists immediately at fair market value. They divide the proceeds. That's," David started, then stopped himself. "Illegal." I offered helpfully. "Yes, using marital assets for undisclosed business ventures without spousal consent qualifies as fraud. Not to mention the tax implications of unreported income." Jessica was studying David with an expression suggesting she was reassessing his competence. "You never told me you were drawing from joint accounts," she said quietly. "Because he's an idiot," Sarah answered. "An idiot who committed crimes, but still an idiot." David finally summoned his voice. "Sarah, I was trying to build something for our future. The construction industry is unpredictable. I wanted to create additional income by stealing from me." Sarah's voice climbed. "By lying to me for months. By sleeping with your business partner while I was planning anniversary dinners and talking about starting a family." That last detail landed on both of them like a physical strike. They apparently hadn't considered how their arrangement, business and otherwise, might affect Sarah's life plans. "How many properties?" I asked Jessica directly. She glanced at David, who nodded miserably. "4. We've done 4 transactions. Profit approximately $60,000, David whispered. "Where is that money now?" Silence. Sarah leaned forward. "Where is my money?" "We reinvested it," Jessica said quietly, "into a larger asset, a commercial building downtown. I had to grudgingly respect their ambition even as I wanted to throttle them both. So let me be certain I understand this correctly," Sarah said, her voice dangerously composed. "You took roughly $100,000 of my money, used it to fund an illegal real estate venture with your mistress, and have tied up all the gains in a commercial property I knew absolutely nothing about." "It isn't technically illegal," David began. "Using marital assets for undisclosed business purposes is fraud," informed him. "Using fictitious business entities to hide income is tax evasion. Doing all of it while carrying on an affair just makes it spectacularly foolish." Jessica was growing visibly more uncomfortable. "David, you told me your wife had approved the investment strategy." Sarah laughed, that same hollow sound from earlier. Did he also mention I approved his sleeping with you? The room went silent except for my grandmother's clock. Here is what's going to happen, Sarah announced, standing and smoothing her jacket. You are going to liquidate that commercial building immediately. You are going to return every cent of my money with interest. You are going to clear the second mortgage and close those secret accounts. And if we decline, Jessica asked, a note of defiance in her voice. Sarah smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could make a room feel significantly colder. Then I contact the IRS about your unreported income, the State Real Estate Licensing Board about your professional ethics violations, and my friend at the newspaper who covers local business crime. Your choice. David moved to argue, but Jessica silenced him. How much time do we have? 30 days, Sarah said. Full financial restitution, and a signed written confession detailing everything. In exchange, I won't dismantle both your careers and have you charged with fraud. After they left, Sarah sank back into the armchair and exhaled a long, shaking breath. Honey, I said gently, that was extraordinary. I learned it from watching you handle Dad's creditors after the divorce, she said. You showed me that people only respond to strength. What are you going to do about the marriage? Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring out the front window at the deepening evening. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I know what I won't do. I won't be the kind of wife who buries this and pretends everything is fine for the sake of keeping the peace. I reached over and squeezed her hand. Whatever you decide, I'm behind you completely. Thanks, Mom, for all of it, for letting me work through this here, for helping me dig into everything, for teaching me not to fold. That's what mothers are for, sweetheart. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that David and Jessica weren't going to comply quietly. People with this much to lose rarely do. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. Sarah's voice was tight with alarm. Mom, they're gone, David and Jessica. I went to the house yesterday to collect more of my things, and all his belongings are cleared out. His car, his laptop, his personal documents, everything. I was upright instantly. What about the commercial building? The money? I called the property management company. The building was sold 2 days ago. Cash transaction. All the proceeds wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Those lying, thieving how much? I asked, bracing myself. $250,000. They took everything, Mom. The home equity, the retirement funds, the profits from their scheme, all of it. I was already getting dressed. Where are you right now? At the house, or what used to be our house. I suppose it's just mine now if I can even manage to keep it. I'm on my way. Don't touch anything else until I get there. The drive over gave me time to think and to get genuinely, profoundly angry. The kind of anger that comes from watching someone deliberately destroy your child's life and realizing they'd been planning it from the beginning. Sarah met me at the door looking hollowed out. The house felt vacant in a way that had nothing to do with missing furniture. They orchestrated this, I said as we stood in David's stripped office. This wasn't a panic response. This was an exit strategy. I should have seen it when they agreed to my demands so easily. Sarah said, when they didn't push back on the timeline, Sweetheart, you're not a criminal. You don't think like one. They had a head start on plotting because they'd been lying far longer. But even as I comforted her, my mind was already working the problem. People who steal $250,000 don't generally stop there. They don't simply vanish into a tropical sunset. Sarah, I said carefully, I think we need to call the authorities. I already did. They told me it's a civil matter. David had legal access to the joint accounts. They can't touch the offshore transfer unless we can demonstrate intent to defraud creditors. What about the IRS, the State Real Estate Board? I filed complaints with everyone you suggested, but these investigations take months, and David and Jessica are long gone. I walked through the empty rooms, studying what they'd left behind, and something nagged at me, something that didn't add up. Sarah, show me exactly what they took and what they left. We made our way through every room. David had taken his clothes, his computer, his personal paperwork, but he'd left behind expensive electronics, his golf clubs, and most curiously, his collection of books on financial strategy and investment. This doesn't add up, I said, picking up a volume on international tax shelters. If David was planning to disappear with stolen money, why leave behind research materials on hiding assets? Maybe he was rushed, or maybe he isn't finished. That thought landed like a bucket of cold water. I grabbed Sarah's arm. What other accounts did David have access to? What about your workplace retirement plan? Your personal investment portfolio? Sarah went pale. He can't get into those. He'd need my authorization. Unless he forged your signature. You said he was proficient with false documentation for the shell company. We spent the next hour calling every financial institution Sarah had accounts with. The news was worse than I'd feared. David had systematically drained every account he could reach over the past 2 weeks, using forged authorization letters and claiming Sarah was abroad on business. Her 401k emptied, her personal savings gone. Even the inheritance account I'd helped her establish years ago, funded by her late grandmother, cleaned out. He took everything, Sarah whispered, staring at the statement printouts. I have nothing left except my checking account and whatever equity remains in the house. How much equity? Maybe 50,000 if I'm optimistic. Not enough to cover the second mortgage he secretly took out. I watched my strong, capable daughter come undone as the full scope of the theft crystallized before her. David hadn't merely been unfaithful. He'd spent months methodically dismantling her financial life, planning his escape while she was planning their future together. Mom, Sarah said in a small, exhausted voice, I think I'm going to lose everything. And that's when something shifted inside me. Some protective maternal force that had been building since Sunday's phone call finally broke the surface. No, I said firmly, you're not, but I can't cover the mortgage payments without David's income. I can't hold onto the house. I'll be starting over from scratch. Sarah, look at me. I waited until her eyes met mine. Your father tried to leave me with nothing after our divorce. He concealed assets, moved money, fabricated business losses to avoid paying support. Do you remember what became of him? A faint, reluctant smile touched the corner of her mouth. You took him apart? I didn't just take him apart. I tracked down everything he tried to hide and made certain he ended up far worse off than if he'd been honest from the beginning. But Mom, that was different. Dad was still here. David and Jessica are gone. Sweetheart, people who steal large sums of money make mistakes. They leave traces, and they always get overconfident. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Martha Harrison's number. Martha was a forensic accountant who specialized in asset recovery for divorce litigation. If anyone in the world could track down David and Jessica's stolen funds, it was her. Martha, it's Margaret Thompson. I need your help with a case involving offshore accounts and financial fraud. As I laid out the situation, I watched Sarah's face shift from despair to hope to something that looked almost like anticipation. 6 weeks, I told Sarah after hanging up, possibly less if they made the errors I suspect they made. And then we recover your money, every penny, plus interest, penalties, and damages. What if they've already spent it? I smiled, and I'm quite sure it wasn't a particularly gentle expression. Then we take everything else they own, everything they ever will own, and we ensure every professional contact in the networks knows precisely what kind of people they are. Sarah straightened. Some of her natural fire was coming back. Mom, she said slowly, I want to learn how to do what you do. What do you mean? I want to learn how to track down people who believe they can steal from others without consequence. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else the way it happened to me. Standing in that gutted house, watching my daughter choose to rise rather than retreat, I felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly moved me to tears. Sarah had been broken, betrayed, and financially demolished. But instead of withdrawing, she was preparing to go on offense. "All right then," I said, "let's go to war." Martha Harrison's office looked like a forensic accounting lab had been dropped into the middle of a law library. Multiple monitors displayed cascading financial data. Legal documents blanketed every surface, and the woman herself looked as though she could face down a hostile federal audit without losing her composure. "Your son-in-law is an amateur," she announced without greeting when Sarah and I arrived, a greedy, overconfident amateur. She brought up a series of financial charts on her primary screen. David Bradley and Jessica Parker thought they were being clever by opening accounts in the Cayman Islands. Unfortunately for them, they chose an institution that operates under cooperation agreements with U.S. law enforcement. "You found the money?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "I found all of it, plus something considerably more interesting." Martha switched to a new screen. "They didn't only steal from you, Sarah. They've been running this real estate scheme for 2 years, with victims spread across 3 different states." The display showed a layered web of shell companies, false identities, and financial transfers. David and Jessica had been methodically preying on divorced women, newly widowed women, and other vulnerable individuals through real estate transactions. "How many victims?" I asked. "At least 12 that I've documented so far. Total theft of approximately $1.8 million. Sarah drew a sharp breath. "They've done this before multiple times. It gets better," Martha continued. "Jessica Parker isn't even her real name. She's actually Jennifer Walsh, originally from Phoenix. She's operated under false identities in multiple cities, partnering with different male accomplices each time. David isn't her first partner. David isn't even her second. She had evidence of identical schemes in Colorado and Texas, each with a different man. She recruits local men with financial vulnerabilities or gambling problems, seduces them, and uses them to access victims' accounts and assets." I felt a cold wave of satisfaction wash over me as this information settled over Sarah. Her husband hadn't been special to Jessica. He'd been a utility, a useful instrument with access to money. "Where are they now?" Sarah asked. Martha pulled up surveillance photographs. David and Jessica were installed at a luxury resort in Costa Rica, apparently savoring their stolen windfall. Costa Rica doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes, Martha explained. "They almost certainly believe they're untouchable." "Are they?" I asked. Martha smiled in a way that reminded me of a shark catching a scent. "Not remotely. Because they committed one critical error." She clicked to a new document. "They purchased property in Costa Rica using the same shell company they used for their American investments. That classifies the purchase as proceeds from illegal activity, which means we can freeze it." "How?" "I've already filed paperwork with the FBI International Asset Forfeiture Unit. By tomorrow, their Costa Rican bank accounts will be frozen and their property seized pending investigation." Sarah stared at the screen. "They're going to lose everything. Everything purchased with stolen money, yes, but Sarah, there's a decision you need to make." Martha opened another file. "The FBI wants to prosecute this as an organized fraud conspiracy. If you're prepared to testify, they're looking at significant federal prison time." "How significant?" 10 to 15 years at minimum. I watched my daughter absorb that. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a trusting wife planning anniversary celebrations. Now, she held the power to send her husband to prison for more than a decade. What happens if I choose not to testify? They might face reduced charges, 3 to 5 years, perhaps. But the other victims deserve justice too. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the surveillance photographs of David and Jessica stretched out by a pool her stolen money had paid for. "I'll testify," she said finally, "but I want to be there when they're arrested." Martha raised an eyebrow. That's unconventional. Unconventional situations call for unconventional approaches, I said. Is it possible? The FBI is coordinating the arrest with Costa Rican authorities. If you're willing to travel and work alongside federal agents, they may permit you to observe. Sarah looked at me. Mom, feel like taking a trip. 2 weeks later, Sarah and I were seated in an FBI surveillance vehicle outside the Hotel President in San Jose, Costa Rica, watching federal agents position themselves for the arrests. Agent Rodriguez had been unexpectedly accommodating about allowing us to observe the operation. Apparently, victims willing to travel internationally to witness justice being served earned a particular degree of respect from law enforcement. Target confirmed. The radio crackled. Male subject at the pool bar. Female subject is in the spa. Through the van's tinted windows, I could see David sitting alone at the poolside bar, dressed in expensive resort clothing, looking entirely without a care in the world. The sight of him filled me with a cold, settled satisfaction. This is really happening, Sarah said softly. They're actually going to be arrested. Yes, they are. And then they're going to learn what it costs to steal from a mother and daughter who don't extend forgiveness easily. The coordinated arrest was executed beautifully. David never sensed it coming. One moment he was lifting a tropical cocktail to his lips, the next he was face down on the pool deck with federal agents reading him his rights in both English and Spanish. Jessica's arrest at the spa was equally gratifying. According to Agent Rodriguez, she attempted to portray herself as an innocent victim of David's schemes until investigators showed her evidence of her previous aliases and prior conspiracies. Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Bradley, Agent Rodriguez said as the suspects were loaded into separate vehicles. They'll be extradited to the United States within the week. The trial should begin in approximately 6 months. What about the money? Sarah asked. Full restitution to all victims is part of the plea arrangement the prosecutor will be offering. If they reject the plea, we'll seize everything regardless, and they'll face maximum sentencing. As our plane climbed out of San Jose that evening, Sarah finally broke the silence. I keep waiting to feel guilty about David, she said, but I don't. Why would you feel guilty about someone who deliberately dismantled your life for personal profit? I thought I'd feel, I don't know, like I was being too severe. I looked at my daughter, this formidable woman who'd been through the fire and come out burning. Sarah, David made choices. He chose to steal from you. He chose to lie to you. He chose to plan his escape while you planned your future. You didn't create him. You simply refused to be his victim. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching David shift uncomfortably in the defendant's chair while Sarah delivered her testimony about the systematic destruction of her financial security. She was remarkable, composed, precise, and devastating in her methodical account of everything he had done. Mrs. Bradley, the prosecutor asked, when you discovered your husband had liquidated your retirement accounts without authorization, what was your reaction? Disbelief, Sarah replied steadily, followed by the understanding that the man I'd been married to for 3 years was essentially someone I'd never actually known. Jessica, being tried separately, had already sealed her fate. Confronted with evidence of multiple prior fraud schemes conducted under different identities, she'd accepted a plea arrangement for 12 years in federal prison. David, it appeared, still believed he could charm his way out of accountability. He was mistaken. The trial ran a full week. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial documents recorded, conversations, surveillance footage, testimony from victims spanning 3 states. David's defense seemed to rest almost entirely on the claim that he'd been manipulated by Jessica, which might have been marginally more credible had the prosecution not introduced evidence showing he'd been researching international money laundering techniques months before they ever met. When the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts, David finally appeared to grasp the full weight of what he'd done. 15 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, a criminal record that would define the rest of his life. But as gratifying as the conviction was, something I'd absorbed during the investigation continued to trouble me. David and Jessica were minor players in a considerably larger game. Agent Rodriguez, I said as we walked out of the courthouse, what happens to the real estate professionals who facilitated their transactions? The banks that processed the suspicious transfers? The attorneys who established the shell companies? That's a much more complex investigation, he admitted. Many of these individuals claim they were unaware the transactions were part of a fraud scheme. Establishing knowledge versus willful ignorance is difficult to prove in court. That evening, over dinner at my house, Sarah and I talked about everything the trial had revealed. It isn't enough, Sarah said firmly. David and Jessica going to prison doesn't help the real estate professionals who are still out there running similar plays. It doesn't protect the next vulnerable person they set their sights on. What are you proposing? I want to build something, Mom. A business that helps people avoid financial fraud in the first place and helps victims recover when they've been targeted anyway. I set down my coffee cup and looked at my daughter with growing admiration. Financial security consulting, she said. We help people audit their financial arrangements before major life events, marriage, divorce, retirement. We teach asset protection. And when someone has been victimized, we help them fight back. The more she talked, the more animated I became. Sarah had taken her personal catastrophe and converted it into a mission. What would you name it? Thompson Bradley Financial Recovery, she said with a small smile. I'm keeping the hyphen as a reminder. Of what? That trusting the wrong person can demolish your life. But refusing to stay demolished can make you stronger than you ever thought possible. 3 months later, we opened our office in downtown Minneapolis. Our first client was Rebecca Mitchell, a 60-year-old widow whose adult children were pressuring her to sell her home and funnel the proceeds into their guaranteed returns investment opportunity. Meeting, but they're my children. Surely I should trust them. Sarah and I exchanged a look. We'd encountered this particular story before, just wearing different faces. Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah said gently, the fact that you're questioning their motives tells me your instincts are already doing their job. Let's help you protect yourself. It took us 2 weeks to uncover that Rebecca's son had nearly $50,000 in gambling debts, and her daughter had been forging Rebecca's signature on financial documents for months. 1 more week to construct a legal trap that caught them in the act of attempted elder financial abuse. How did you know? Rebecca asked after we'd helped her file charges and secure her accounts. Experience, I said simply. Sometimes the people closest to us are the most capable of causing us harm, because they know we won't suspect them until it's already too late. Our firm expanded quickly, driven almost entirely by word of mouth, victims referring other potential victims, attorneys sending clients who needed asset recovery support, law enforcement agencies recommending us for fraud prevention education. Each case taught us something new about how financial predators think and why certain people become their targets. But more importantly, each successful intervention felt like a small but meaningful victory against every David Bradley and Jessica Parker in the world. Sarah, I said one evening, reviewing our growing case files, do you ever regret how everything unfolded? The divorce, the trial, the way your life was turned upside down. She thought for a moment, looking out through the window at the city lights. What I regret is having been naive enough to trust someone who hadn't earned it. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret refusing to become a victim. And I don't regret turning my worst experience into something that shields other people, even though it cost you your marriage. That marriage was constructed on falsehoods from the very beginning. I just hadn't learned that yet. Now I know what genuine partnership looks like. She gestured around our office. This is what it feels like to work beside someone who truly has your back. Looking at what we'd built together, mother and daughter, teacher and student, 2 women who had refused to let criminals hollow out their lives, I felt a profound and abiding satisfaction. David had imagined he was stealing Sarah's money and her future. Instead, he had inadvertently given her something far more valuable, the proof that she was capable of fighting back and winning. Some lessons come at a steep price, but the ones that matter most always do. A year after David's conviction, the phone rang with the kind of case that makes your blood run cold. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Detective Lisa Park with Minneapolis PD. We have a situation that may require your expertise." I put the call on speaker so Sarah could hear. Detective Park explained they had arrested a man named Marcus Webb for attempting to poison his elderly mother with antifreeze. During the investigation, they discovered evidence that Marcus had been working within a broader network targeting seniors for financial exploitation, with the attempted murder representing only the final stage of an extended scheme. Marcus had already stolen over $200,000 from his mother through forged power of attorney documents. Detective Park continued and had persuaded her to transfer the deed of her home to him. His partner, a woman who helped him identify targets and falsify documents, is still at large. We believe she has already moved on to new victims. We need someone who understands financial fraud to help us map her operational pattern. An hour later, we were in a police conference room reviewing evidence that turned my stomach, photographs of elderly victims, financial records showing coordinated, methodical theft, a clear and disturbing pattern of predatory behavior aimed at the most defenseless members of our community. "This woman goes by Patricia," Detective Park explained. "But as in your previous case, we suspect that's an alias. She presents herself as a home health care aide, earns the complete trust of elderly clients, then progressively manipulates them into surrendering financial control. How many victims so far?" 5. We've confirmed in Minneapolis. We've linked her to identical crimes in Milwaukee and Chicago. The pattern is always the same. She works as a caregiver for 6 to 8 months, achieves total trust, then vanishes with everything the person owns. Sarah was studying the victim profiles. All of these people were isolated. No immediate family nearby. Limited social networks. She's deliberately selecting people who won't be missed quickly. Precisely, and Marcus Webb served as her enforcer. When victims became suspicious or started asking inconvenient questions, he escalated to intimidation, or in his own mother's case, attempted murder. I studied the surveillance photographs of Patricia Kane, mid-50s, professionally presented, the kind of woman elderly people would instinctively trust with their medications, their routines, and ultimately their financial lives. Detective Park, we'll do everything we can, but this woman is dangerous in ways David and Jessica never were. She isn't just taking money. She is systematically destroying vulnerable people's dignity and security, which is exactly why we need to stop her before she kills someone. Over the following 2 weeks, Sarah and I worked alongside the police to analyze Patricia's methods and anticipate her next move. She operated from a clear template: identify isolated elderly targets through healthcare agency placements, spend months cultivating trust and dependency, gradually seize control of their finances, then disappear before anyone registered the theft. She's intelligent, Sarah observed as we charted her known activities. She never stays in a single city long enough to generate a pattern that local law enforcement would detect. But she made one mistake, I said, pointing to a financial record. She used the same offshore bank as David and Jessica. Martha may be able to trace her funds. 3 days later, Martha called with a breakthrough. "I found her," she announced. Patricia Kane is actually Patricia Kowalski, originally from Detroit. She's been running variations of this scheme for over a decade, targeting elderly victims in at least 8 states. Where is she now? According to her most recent financial activity, Denver, Colorado, and Margaret, there's something else. Tell me. She's no longer operating alone. She's recruited at least 3 additional people, and they are functioning as an organized syndicate. They've industrialized the process. One person identifies targets, one manages the caregiving and psychological manipulation, one handles the financial extraction, and one handles damage control when things unravel. The scale was staggering. Patricia had evolved from a lone predator into the architect of a multi-state criminal enterprise targeting the elderly. When we briefed Detective Park, she immediately escalated to the FBI. Within hours, our local case had become part of a federal investigation into organized elder exploitation. "Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Bradley," Agent Martinez said during our first federal briefing, "would you be willing to serve as consultants on this investigation? Your background in financial fraud and your understanding of victim psychology could be tremendously valuable." Sarah and I looked at each other. We had started Thompson Bradley Financial Recovery to help individual victims. Now we were being asked to help dismantle an entire criminal organization. 6 weeks later, we participated in a coordinated federal operation that resulted in the arrest of Patricia Kowalski and 7 members of her network across 4 states. The investigation revealed they had stolen over $3 million from elderly victims and had directly contributed to the deaths of at least 2 people who had been denied proper medical attention while under their so-called care. Patricia herself was apprehended in Denver while actively posing as a caregiver for an 86-year-old retired schoolteacher named Helen Morrison, in the process of transferring Helen's life savings to an offshore account. "You saved my life," Helen told us when we visited after Patricia's arrest. She'd already persuaded me to sign documents giving her power of attorney. Next week, I was supposed to hand over the deed to my home. Standing in Helen's modest living room, looking at this fragile, elderly woman who had come so terrifyingly close to losing everything, I felt the same fierce, protective anger that had been burning in me since Sarah's first panicked phone call about David. "Helen, people like Patricia rely on their victims being too trusting or too embarrassed to push back. But you did nothing wrong. You survived, and your survival helped us stop her from doing this to anyone else." Driving home that night, Sarah was unusually quiet. "Mom," she said finally, "do you actually think we're making a real difference? Or are we just playing an endless round of whack-a-mole with criminals?" I thought about it as we wound through the Minneapolis suburbs, past ordinary houses where ordinary people lived mostly unaware of the predators who specifically sought out human vulnerability. "Sarah, 3 years ago you were a trusting wife who saw the best in people. David's betrayal could have made you guarded and bitter. Instead, it made you fierce and protective of others. But there will always be more people like David and Patricia." "Yes, there will, but there will also be more people like Helen Morrison, who survive because someone taught them to recognize the warning signs. More elderly people who hold onto their savings because someone educated them about how these predators operate." "You really believe we're making a difference?" "I believe we're making the difference we're capable of making, and sometimes that's enough. But even as I said it, I knew our most significant case was still ahead of us." Because Patricia Kowalski had mentioned something during her interrogation that had kept me awake ever since. She spoke of a mentor, someone who had taught her advanced techniques for manipulating elderly victims, someone who had been running these schemes for decades without ever being caught, someone who was still out there, teaching others how to prey on vulnerable people for profit. That person was going to become our next target. I was certain of it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 2 years after David's first arrest. Agent Martinez's voice carried an edge of urgency I hadn't heard before. "Margaret, we need you and Sarah in Washington immediately. Patricia Kowalski is ready to discuss her mentor, but she'll only speak with you two present. Why specifically us? She says you're the only victim advocates she trusts to ensure her information results in genuine justice rather than just another plea reduction. She wants to know that what she tells us actually matters. 6 hours later, Sarah and I were seated across a metal table from Patricia Kowalski in a federal detention facility outside Washington, D.C. Patricia looked older than her 57 years worn down by months in custody. But her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. Even in prison-issue clothing, she projected a kind of contained authority that had made so many people trust her with their most vulnerable years. "Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Bradley," she said, "thank you for making the trip. We're here because you claim to have information about other criminals preying on the elderly," Sarah said flatly. "Not because we have any personal interest in improving your circumstances." Patricia smiled thinly. "Fair enough, you want the person who trained me. His name is Dr. Richard Hawthorne. He's a licensed psychologist specializing in geriatric care. For the past 15 years, he's used his position to identify and exploit elderly patients with significant assets." I felt a chill move through me. A licensed psychologist would have unconstrained access to vulnerable people, comprehensive knowledge of their mental states and family dynamics, and the professional authority to influence both patients and the people who loved them. "Where does he operate?" Agent Martinez asked. "Multiple locations. He contracts with nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and hospitals throughout the Midwest, but his primary base is Chicago." Patricia sketched out a map of Dr. Hawthorne's network. The scope was breathtaking. Dozens of healthcare facilities, hundreds of potential victims, a systematized approach to exploitation that made her own operation seem rudimentary by comparison. "How does it work?" Sarah asked. "Dr. Hawthorne identifies patients with significant assets but minimal family oversight. He gradually persuades them that they're experiencing early-stage dementia or other cognitive deterioration. Then he recommends they assign power of attorney to someone trustworthy, typically one of his associates, presenting themselves as a caring family, acquaintance, or professional advisor. And the families simply accept his clinical judgment. He's extremely skilled. He documents everything carefully, employs precise medical language, produces convincing evidence of cognitive decline. Most families want to believe they're doing what's right for their elderly parent." "How many victims over 15 years?" I asked. "Probably 200, possibly more. Dr. Hawthorne keeps meticulous records of his work." 200 people. 200 elderly individuals systematically robbed of their life savings by someone they trusted to protect their mental health. "Patricia," Sarah said, "why are you telling us this now? What do you gain from it?" Patricia was silent for a long moment, studying her folded hands. "Because I came to understand something during my time here," she said finally. "I became a monster. I convinced myself I was merely redirecting money from people who no longer needed it. But I was annihilating lives, real people with families, with dignity, with the right to determine their own futures. And Dr. Hawthorne is worse than I ever was, because he hides his predation behind the authority of a medical credential. He has turned elder exploitation into something that looks from the outside like compassionate professional care." She looked directly at me. "Mrs. Thompson, you stopped me from taking Helen Morrison's future. But Dr. Hawthorne destroyed dozens of people like Helen before I ever learned his name." On the drive back to the airport, Sarah and I sat with the weight of what we'd learned. "This is different from anything we've handled before," she said finally. "If Patricia is telling the truth, Dr. Hawthorne has operated for 15 years without consequence because he's concealed everything behind professional credentials and medical authority. Which means we have to approach this very differently." I agreed, and with help from people who understand the healthcare system from the inside. 3 days later, we were back in Chicago in a conference room with a federal team that specialized in healthcare fraud. The briefing was sobering. Dr. Richard Hawthorne has a pristine professional reputation, Agent Chen explained. A licensed psychologist, published researcher, a regular speaker at geriatric care conferences. If he's running the operation Patricia described, he has been extremely careful to quarantine his criminal activities from his legitimate practice. What's our approach? Surveillance, financial analysis, and undercover investigation. We need to catch him in the act of manipulating a patient or coordinating with his criminal network. How long will that take? Months, possibly a year or more. Patience has never been my greatest virtue, especially not when vulnerable people are being harmed while we gather evidence. Agent Chen, I said, what if there were a way to compress the timeline? What if we gave Dr. Hawthorne a target he couldn't pass up? Sarah was already smiling. That same predator